The alarm clock buzzed at exactly 5:30 in the morning, just like it had every single day for the past 15 years. Harold Mitchell opened his eyes slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his left knee where shrapnel from an IED explosion in Afghanistan had left its permanent mark. At 72 years old, Harold had learned to accept these daily reminders of his service, treating them not as complaints but as proof that he was still alive when so many of his brothers weren't. He sat up carefully on the edge of his narrow bed, looking around the small studio apartment that had been his home since his wife Martha passed away 3 years ago. The walls were decorated with faded photographs from his military service, pictures of young men in uniform who had shared trenches, meals, and dreams with him decades ago. Some of those faces belonged to men who never made it home. Others, like Harold, had returned but carried invisible wounds that never quite healed. The morning routine never changed. Harold shuffled to the small kitchenette and put the kettle on for tea. While waiting for the water to boil, he performed the stretching exercises the VA doctor had recommended for his arthritic joints. Each movement was deliberate and slow, a meditation that helped him prepare for another day in a world that seemed to move faster and grow stranger with each passing year. After his tea and a simple breakfast of toast and jam, Harold dressed carefully in his best clothes. Today was special because he had an appointment at the local government office to discuss his veterans' benefits. The paperwork had been confusing, and, despite his pride in handling his own affairs, he had finally admitted he needed help understanding the new digital systems they insisted everyone use. Harold had served in 3 different conflicts during his 40-year military career. He had been a young private in Vietnam, a seasoned sergeant in the Gulf War, and, finally, a senior non-commissioned officer in Afghanistan before retiring. Each war had taught him different lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the true cost of freedom. But nothing had prepared him for the challenge of navigating civilian bureaucracy in his golden years. He looked at himself in the small mirror by the door, straightening his tie and smoothing down his gray hair. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the strong, confident soldier he had once been. His shoulders were stooped, his face lined with wrinkles, and his hands trembled slightly from a condition the doctors couldn't quite explain. But his eyes still held the same determination that had carried him through decades of service to his country. The bus ride to downtown took 45 minutes, and Harold always sat in the same seat near the front where he could easily get off without struggling past other passengers. He watched the city change outside the window, noting how different everything looked from when he was young. The neighborhoods he remembered from his youth had been replaced by glass towers and chain restaurants. The sense of community he had known growing up seemed to have disappeared, replaced by people who stared at their phones instead of talking to each other. During the ride, Harold thought about his grandson Tommy, who was currently serving his first deployment overseas. Tommy had joined the army against his family's wishes, inspired by his grandfather's stories of service and honor. Harold worried about the boy constantly, knowing firsthand the physical and emotional toll that combat could take on even the strongest men. He had written Tommy a letter every week since his deployment began, sharing advice and encouragement while carefully avoiding the darker realities of war. When Harold arrived at the government building, he was struck by how imposing and impersonal it seemed. The lobby was filled with people rushing around with purpose, their conversations echoing off the marble walls. Security guards checked bags and directed visitors to different floors with efficient but cold professionalism. Harold felt small and invisible in the crowd, just another elderly citizen seeking help with problems that seemed insignificant to everyone but himself. He made his way to the Veterans Affairs office on the 3rd floor, where he joined a line of other veterans waiting for assistance. Looking around, Harold recognized the same expression on many faces that he saw in his own mirror each morning, men and women who had served their country with pride but now struggled to navigate a system that seemed designed to frustrate rather than help them. The wait was long, and Harold's knee began to ache from standing. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, trying to find a comfortable position while maintaining his military bearing. Despite the discomfort, he refused to complain or ask for special treatment. That wasn't the way he had been raised, and it certainly wasn't the way the army had trained him. While waiting, Harold struck up a conversation with a younger veteran named Marcus who had served in Iraq. Marcus was having trouble with his disability claim, frustrated by months of paperwork and conflicting information from different government agencies. Harold listened patiently to the young man's story, offering quiet words of encouragement and sharing his own experiences with the Veterans Benefits System. As they talked, Harold learned that Marcus had lost his job recently and was struggling to support his family. The veterans' benefits were his only hope for maintaining his apartment and keeping his children in school. Harold's heart went out to the young man, remembering his own difficult transition from military to civilian life decades earlier. He quietly slipped Marcus a business card for a veterans advocacy group that had helped him in the past, along with $20 from his own limited funds. When Harold's name was finally called, he followed a tired-looking clerk to a small office filled with filing cabinets and computer equipment. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patterson, seemed genuinely interested in helping him understand his benefits package. She explained the new online system patiently, showing Harold how to access his account and track the status of his claims. Mrs. Patterson had a son in the military herself, and Harold could see the worry in her eyes when she mentioned his upcoming deployment. They spent a few extra minutes talking about the challenges facing military families, sharing stories and finding common ground despite their different backgrounds. It was the kind of human connection that Harold had been missing in his daily life, a reminder that kindness and understanding still existed in the world. After completing his business at the government office, Harold decided to take a detour through the city center on his way home. He had always enjoyed walking through the historic district, where old buildings and monuments reminded him of better times. The weather was pleasant, and he felt energized by his successful morning at the veterans' office. As he walked slowly down the main street, Harold noticed more and more people hurrying past him without making eye contact. Everyone seemed to be in a rush, focused on their phones or their own concerns. He remembered when people used to acknowledge each other on the street, when veterans were treated with respect and gratitude for their service. Now he felt like a ghost from a different era, invisible and irrelevant in a world that had moved on without him. Harold's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of shouting coming from up ahead. Near the entrance to the historic government building where the Royal Guard performed their ceremonial duties, a crowd was beginning to gather. He could see people pointing and pulling out their phones to record whatever was happening. His military instincts kicked in, and, despite his age and physical limitations, Harold found himself walking faster toward the commotion. The scene that greeted him was disturbing and all too familiar. A young man in expensive clothes and gold jewelry was causing a disturbance, shouting obscenities and threatening the ceremonial guards who stood at attention in their traditional uniforms. The guards, bound by their duty to remain still and silent, could only endure the verbal abuse while maintaining their professional composure. Harold recognized the type immediately, a privileged young man who had never faced real consequences for his actions, someone who saw respect as weakness and tradition as something to be mocked. The sight filled Harold with a mixture of sadness and anger, not just for the guards being humiliated, but for what this behavior represented about the direction society was heading. As Harold moved closer to get a better view of the situation, he began to understand that this was more than just a random outburst. The young man, who couldn't have been more than 25 years old, was deliberately trying to provoke the guards into breaking their ceremonial silence. He was performing for the crowd of onlookers, many of whom were recording the incident with their phones, seemingly more interested in capturing something dramatic than in stopping the harassment. Harold felt his hands clench into fists, muscle memory from decades of military training overriding his age and frailty. He had spent his entire adult life defending the values and traditions that this young man was mocking, and seeing the guards forced to endure such treatment without being able to defend themselves brought back memories of his own experiences with bullies and cowards who only showed courage when facing those who couldn't fight back. The crowd continued to grow, but Harold noticed that no one seemed willing to step forward and intervene. People whispered among themselves and shook their heads disapprovingly, but they remained safely on the sidelines, unwilling to risk confrontation. It was a perfect example of the bystander effect that Harold had witnessed too many times in his life, good people doing nothing while bad behavior went unchallenged. As the verbal harassment continued, Harold found himself thinking about all the young men and women he had served with over the years, many of whom had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect the freedoms that this young man was taking for granted. He thought about his grandson Tommy, currently risking his life overseas, and wondered what kind of world he would come home to if this behavior became normalized. The moment of decision was approaching rapidly, and Harold could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline that had carried him through countless dangerous situations during his military career. At 72 years old, with a bad knee and trembling hands, he knew he was no match for a younger, stronger opponent. But some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. Harold took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders as much as his aged spine would allow, and began walking toward the confrontation with the measured pace of a soldier approaching the enemy. In his mind, he could hear the voices of his drill sergeants from decades past, reminding him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Today, an old veteran was about to remind the world that some things were still worth defending. The young man's name was Derek Williams, though most people in his circle knew him by his social media handle D-Money or simply as the son of a wealthy real estate developer who had never told him no. At 24 years old, Derek had never worked a real job, never faced genuine hardship, and certainly never learned the value of respect for others. His entire life had been a series of escalating bad behaviors that were either ignored, excused, or covered up by his father's money and influence. Derek wore designer clothes that cost more than Harold's monthly rent, and his wrists were heavy with gold chains that caught the sunlight as he gestured wildly at the motionless guards. His expensive sneakers, still pristine despite being worn for weeks, squeaked against the polished stone steps as he paced back and forth like a predator circling his prey. Everything about his appearance screamed wealth and privilege, but his behavior revealed a poverty of character that no amount of money could disguise. This wasn't Derek's first public outburst, though it might prove to be his most significant. He had a history of confrontations with service workers, police officers, and anyone else he perceived as being beneath his social status. His social media accounts were filled with videos of him owning retail employees, arguing with restaurant staff, and generally treating other human beings as entertainment for his followers. Each incident had emboldened him further, convincing him that his wealth made him untouchable. The ceremonial guards who were bearing the brunt of Derek's abuse were members of an elite military unit with decades of combined service experience. These men had served in combat zones, protected dignitaries, and represented their nation with honor in ceremonies around the world. Their current assignment required them to stand motionless for hours at a time, ignoring weather, discomfort, and distractions while maintaining perfect military bearing. It was a duty they took seriously, both as professional soldiers and as guardians of tradition. The lead guard, Sergeant Major James Morrison, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq before being selected for ceremonial duty. At 38 years old, Morrison was a decorated combat veteran who had earned his position through excellence, dedication, and an unblemished service record. Standing perfectly still while being verbally abused by a spoiled civilian was perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of his military career, requiring more self-control than facing enemy fire. Morrison could see Derek's behavior escalating with each passing minute, and he recognized the signs of someone building toward physical violence. In combat, he would have been authorized to neutralize such a threat immediately. Here, bound by ceremony and protocol, he could only maintain his position and trust that civilian authorities would eventually intervene. The irony wasn't lost on him that he felt more vulnerable standing guard in his own country than he had in active war zones. The other guards shared similar backgrounds and feelings. They were all experienced soldiers who had volunteered for ceremonial duty as an honor, not expecting to become targets for public harassment. Each man fought his own internal battle between professional discipline and human instinct, knowing that their response to this situation would be remembered and judged long after Derek Williams had moved on to his next victim. Meanwhile, Harold continued his slow but determined approach toward the confrontation. His military training had taught him to assess threats and plan responses even in the most challenging circumstances. Despite his physical limitations, his tactical mind remained sharp, automatically calculating angles of approach, escape routes, and potential consequences of various actions. As he walked, Harold noticed details that the casual observers missed. Derek's expensive clothes couldn't hide the telltale signs of someone who had never faced real physical confrontation, soft hands that had never known manual labor, a posture that suggested more bluster than genuine strength, and a way of moving that indicated he had always relied on others to fight his battles. More importantly, Harold recognized the body language of someone building toward violence, the subtle shifts and preparations that preceded physical aggression. The crowd around the incident had grown to include tourists, office workers on their lunch break, and local residents drawn by the commotion. Most people seemed content to watch and record, treating the harassment as free entertainment rather than a serious situation requiring intervention. Harold felt disgusted by their passivity, remembering a time when citizens felt a responsibility to step forward when they witnessed wrongdoing. Among the onlookers, Harold noticed several other veterans, identifiable by their bearing, their haircuts, or the subtle military-themed clothing they wore. These men watched the scene with the same combination of anger and frustration that Harold felt, recognizing both the professionalism of the guards and the cowardice of their tormentor. Yet they too remained on the sidelines, perhaps held back by age, disability, or simply the social conditioning that discouraged involvement in confrontations. Harold's progress toward the incident was noted by some in the crowd, though most dismissed him as just another elderly spectator drawn by curiosity. A few people glanced at him with mild concern, wondering if the old man fully understood what he was walking into. None of them recognized the quiet determination in his step or the way his eyes never left Derek Williams, tracking the young man's movements with the focused attention of a predator evaluating prey. As Harold drew closer, he could hear Derek's words more clearly, and the content made his anger burn hotter. The young man wasn't just making general threats or complaints, he was specifically attacking the guards' military service, mocking their uniforms, and making crude jokes about veterans and wounded warriors. Each comment was like a physical blow to Harold, who had watched too many good men die defending the values this spoiled child was ridiculing. Derek's performance had evolved from simple harassment to a more elaborate show for his growing audience. He pulled out his phone and began live-streaming the encounter, narrating his actions for his online followers while escalating his verbal abuse of the guards. His comments section filled with encouragement from other privileged young people who found his behavior amusing, their reactions further fueling his aggression. The live-stream aspect added a new dimension to the situation that Harold hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just a local incident anymore, it was being broadcast to potentially thousands of viewers, turning the harassment of decorated soldiers into viral entertainment. The thought that Derek's followers were cheering him on made Harold's jaw clench with suppressed rage. Harold paused about 20 feet from Derek, close enough to intervene quickly but far enough away to avoid being immediately noticed. From this position, he could see everything clearly: Derek's increasingly aggressive posture, the rigid discipline of the guards, and the growing excitement of the crowd. He also noticed something that others had missed: a police officer approaching from the opposite direction, though still too far away to intervene immediately. The decision point was approaching rapidly. Harold could see that Derek was working himself up to some kind of dramatic climax for his online audience, and all the signs suggested that physical violence was imminent. The guards remained perfectly disciplined, but Harold could see the tension in their bodies, the slight tightening of muscles that indicated they were preparing for the possibility of having to defend themselves while maintaining their ceremonial roles. Derek moved closer to Sergeant Major Morrison, his voice getting louder and more aggressive with each step. He began making increasingly personal attacks, questioning the guard's competence, his appearance, and his worth as a human being. The verbal assault was calculated to provoke a reaction, designed to break the professional composure that military training had instilled over decades of service. Harold felt his heart rate increase and his vision narrow to focus solely on Derek Williams. The years fell away, and, for a moment, he wasn't a 72-year-old retiree with arthritis and a bad knee. He was a soldier again, faced with a clear threat to his brothers in arms, equipped with the skills and mindset that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments. The transformation was internal but profound. Harold Mitchell, the vulnerable elderly man, was replaced by Sergeant Major Mitchell, the warrior. The crowd sensed that something was about to happen, though they couldn't have predicted what form it would take. Conversations quieted, phones turned to record, and everyone's attention focused on the confrontation between Derek and the ceremonial guards. The tension was palpable, electric, with the potential for violence that everyone could feel but no one was willing to address. Derek raised his hand towards Sergeant Major Morrison's face, his fingers just inches from the guard's nose as he continued his verbal assault. It was a deliberate provocation, a test to see how far he could push before getting a reaction. The livestream chat exploded with comments urging him to get physical, to touch the statue, and prove that he wasn't afraid of the toy soldiers standing at attention. Harold took his first step forward, then another. His movement was noticed by several people in the crowd, though they assumed he was just an old man trying to get a better view of the excitement. None of them recognized the purposeful stride of a combat veteran moving toward contact with the enemy, or the way his hands had unconsciously assumed a position that would allow him to react quickly to any threat. The moment of truth was seconds away, and Harold could feel the familiar calm that had always come over him before battle. His breathing steadied, his vision sharpened, and his mind cleared of everything except the immediate tactical situation. At 72 years old, carrying the accumulated damage of 4 decades of military service, Harold Mitchell was about to remind everyone present that some things never change: honor, duty, and the willingness to stand up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. Derek's hand moved closer to Morrison's face, his voice reaching a crescendo of abuse and threats. The guard remained motionless, a statue of military discipline and professional pride. The crowd held its breath, sensing that the confrontation was about to reach its climax. And Harold Mitchell, forgotten by everyone except the ghosts of fallen comrades who seemed to march beside him, closed the final distance between himself and a moment that would define the rest of his life. The exact moment when Derek Williams decided to cross the line from verbal harassment to physical assault would later be debated by thousands of people who watched the incident unfold online. Some said it was when his livestream viewers started daring him to actually touch one of the guards. Others pointed to the moment when he noticed a news crew arriving in the distance and realized this could be his biggest viral moment yet. But those who understood men like Derek knew the truth: he had always intended for this to escalate to violence. Everything else was just showmanship. Derek pulled his hand back as if preparing to slap Sergeant Major Morrison across the face, his movements exaggerated and theatrical for the benefit of his online audience. The livestream chat was going wild, filled with fire emojis and comments urging him to do it and make them react. His follower count was climbing rapidly as word spread across social media that something big was happening. This was exactly the kind of attention Derek craved, thousands of strangers watching him assert his dominance over people who couldn't fight back. "What are you gonna do about it, soldier boy?" Derek taunted, his voice loud enough for everyone in the crowd to hear clearly. "You just gonna stand there like a little toy while I do whatever I want? Is this what our tax money pays for? Useless decorations who can't even defend themselves?" The words hit Harold like physical blows, each insult a direct attack on everything he had spent his life defending. He could feel his blood pressure rising, his vision beginning to tunnel with the kind of focused rage that had carried him through the most dangerous moments of his military career. But underneath the anger was something else, a cold, calculating clarity that told him exactly what he needed to do and when he needed to do it. Sergeant Major Morrison remained motionless, though Harold could see the almost imperceptible tension in the man's jaw that indicated just how much self-control he was exercising. Morrison had faced enemy fighters, improvised explosive devices, and the chaos of urban warfare, but this might have been the greatest test of discipline in his entire career. The guard's eyes stared straight ahead, looking through Derek as if he didn't exist, maintaining the perfect military bearing that his training and pride demanded. The other ceremonial guards showed similar restraint, though each man was fighting his own internal battle between duty and instinct. They were warriors forced to stand helpless while their honor was attacked by someone who had never risked anything for his country or anyone else. Their silence wasn't weakness, it was strength of the highest order, the kind of discipline that could only come from years of service and an unshakable commitment to their oath. Harold was now close enough to reach Derek in 3 quick steps, though the young man remained completely unaware of his presence. Derek was so focused on his performance for the cameras and his online audience that he had tunnel vision, seeing only his targets and ignoring everything else around him. It was a tactical mistake that any experienced soldier would have recognized immediately, losing situational awareness in a potentially hostile environment. The crowd had grown larger and more animated, with people pushing closer to get better photos and videos of the confrontation. Someone near the back was providing live commentary for their own social media followers, describing Derek's actions with the excited tone of a sports announcer calling a game. The entire scene had taken on a carnival atmosphere that disgusted Harold almost as much as Derek's behavior itself. Harold noticed that several people in the crowd were wearing military-themed clothing or veteran organization hats, marking them as former service members. These men watched the scene with barely contained fury, their hands clenched into fists and their postures rigid with suppressed aggression. Like Harold, they recognized the professionalism of the ceremonial guards and were sickened by Derek's attacks on military tradition and honor. But they remained frozen by social conditioning, uncertain about when civilian intervention became justified. The police officer Harold had spotted earlier was still too far away to intervene immediately, though he was walking faster now as he recognized that the situation was escalating toward violence. Harold calculated that the officer would need at least 2 more minutes to reach the scene, and he could tell from Derek's body language that the young man didn't plan to wait that long before making his move. Derek stepped even closer to Morrison, now standing just arm's length from the guard with his phone held high to capture every moment. His followers were urging him on with increasingly aggressive comments, and Harold could see the exact moment when Derek made his final decision. The young man's posture shifted, his weight moving to his back foot as he prepared to throw a punch at Morrison's face. "Time to wake up, soldier boy," Derek shouted, pulling his right hand back in an obvious preparation for a punch that would be seen by thousands of viewers within minutes of its occurrence. That was the moment Harold Mitchell chose to step out of the crowd and into history. "Son," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had commanded soldiers in combat, "I think you might want to reconsider what you're about to do." Derek spun around, startled by the unexpected interruption of his performance. His eyes took in Harold's elderly appearance, the gray hair, the stooped shoulders, the careful way he moved that suggested physical frailty. Derek's expression shifted from surprise to amusement as he realized that his challenger was a 72-year-old man who looked like he might have trouble walking up a flight of stairs. "Are you serious, old man?" Derek laughed, turning his phone to include Harold in the livestream. "What are you gonna do about it? Call the manager? Report me to the nursing home? This is between me and these toy soldiers, so why don't you shuffle back to wherever you came from before you get hurt?" The crowd's attention shifted to this unexpected development, phones turning to capture the new dynamic between Derek and Harold. Some people smiled, anticipating an amusing exchange between the arrogant young man and the elderly veteran. Others looked concerned, worried that Harold was about to become the next victim of Derek's aggression. Harold didn't respond to Derek's taunts immediately. Instead, he looked past the young man to make eye contact with Sergeant Major Morrison. What passed between the two veterans in that moment was invisible to the crowd but unmistakable to anyone who had served in combat. It was a look of mutual recognition, respect, and understanding, one warrior acknowledging another across the barriers of age, rank, and circumstance. Morrison's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly, a tiny breach of ceremonial protocol that conveyed volumes. In that glance, Harold saw gratitude, concern, and a soldier's assessment of the tactical situation. Morrison was telling Harold that he appreciated the intervention but was worried about what it might cost the elderly veteran. Harold's return look conveyed his own message, that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. "I served 40 years in the United States Army," Harold said finally, his voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. 3 wars, dozens of deployments, and I've seen plenty of young men like you who think disrespect makes them tough. Usually, they learn better before they hurt innocent people. Seems like your education got skipped somehow." Derek's amusement increased as he processed Harold's words. Here was an old soldier, probably living on a pension and disability checks, trying to lecture him about respect. The irony was too perfect for Derek's social media narrative, the past confronting the present, tradition trying to hold back progress, weakness challenging strength. "Oh, this is rich," Derek announced to his phone camera and the growing crowd. "Grandpa here thinks his little war stories scare me. Newsflash, old man, your time is over. Nobody cares about your ancient history or your precious military honor. This is my world now, and these toy soldiers work for me. I pay their salaries with my tax money, which means I can do whatever I want to them." Harold absorbed Derek's words without visible reaction, though inside he felt the familiar cold anger that had carried him through the most dangerous moments of his military career. He had faced enemy soldiers who fought with passion and conviction, and he had respected them even while trying to kill them. But Derek Williams represented something worse than an honorable enemy. He was a coward and a bully who attacked those who couldn't defend themselves. "You're right about one thing, son," Harold said, taking a small step closer to Derek.
Times have changed. Used to be that people like you learned manners before they became problems. But, you know what hasn't changed? Actions have consequences, and some lines shouldn't be crossed.
Derek was fully engaged now, sensing an opportunity to humiliate not just the ceremonial guards but an entire generation of veterans who represented everything he despised about traditional American values. His online audience was eating it up, sharing the stream and tagging their friends to watch the confrontation unfold in real time.
What lines?
Derek demanded, his voice rising with excitement.
What are you gonna do, old man?
You can barely stand up straight.
You think you can stop me from doing whatever I want to these useless tin soldiers?
Harold glanced around at the crowd, noting their expressions and body language. Most people seemed uncomfortable but unwilling to get involved, content to let someone else take responsibility for stopping Derek's behavior.
A few were clearly enjoying the drama, treating it as free entertainment.
But Harold also saw anger in some faces, particularly among the other veterans who recognized what was at stake in this confrontation. "I'm not going to stop you," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. "I'm just going to make sure you understand the full cost of your choices.
See, son, you're not just attacking these guards. You're attacking everything they represent: service, sacrifice, honor.
You're mocking every veteran who ever put their life on the line for this country.
Including the ones who didn't make it home." Derek rolled his eyes dramatically for his audience.
"Spare me the patriotic bullshit, Grandpa. I don't owe you or anyone else anything just because you signed up to play soldier 100 years ago.
This isn't World War II, and you're not John Wayne.
This is reality, and reality is that I can do whatever I want because I've got the money and the power to get away with it." Harold felt something shift inside him at those words, a door closing on diplomacy and opening on direct action. He had given Derek every opportunity to choose a different path, had offered him the chance to walk away with his dignity intact. But the young man had made his position clear, he was committed to his course of action and convinced of his invulnerability. "You're probably right about getting away with it," Harold agreed, his tone remaining conversational despite the tension radiating from his posture.
"Rich kids usually do. But that doesn't mean it comes free. Everything has a price, son. Question is whether you're prepared to pay it."
Derek laughed again, louder this time, playing to his audience both online and in person.
"What price? What could you possibly do to me, old man? Sue me? My dad's got better lawyers than you've got Social Security checks. Call the cops? They work for people like me too.
Face the facts, you're powerless, just like these toy soldiers.
The only difference is they're smart enough to keep their mouths shut."
Harold nodded slowly, as if considering Derek's words carefully.
"You know what, son? You might be absolutely right. I probably can't do much to someone with your advantages.
But here's the thing about us old soldiers, we don't give up easy. And sometimes, when everything else fails, we fall back on the basics." Derek was about to ask what Harold meant by basics when the old veteran moved with a speed and precision that caught everyone completely off guard. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms, analyzed by combat sports experts, and debated by armchair warriors for years to come. But, for those who witnessed it in person, the moment Harold Mitchell moved was like watching history and physics collaborate to deliver a lesson that transcended mere entertainment. Derek had been in the middle of turning back toward Sergeant Major Morrison, preparing to finally throw the punch that would make him internet famous, when Harold's right hand shot out with the speed and precision of a man who had spent decades training for close-quarters combat. The strike wasn't flashy or dramatic, it was a simple, efficient movement that targeted Derek's solar plexus with surgical accuracy. The impact drove every molecule of air from Derek's lungs and sent shockwaves through his nervous system that his privileged upbringing had never prepared him for. His expensive phone flew from his hand, tumbling through the air in a perfect arc before shattering against the stone steps in a spray of glass and metal. The livestream ended abruptly, cutting off thousands of viewers just as they were witnessing their hero's moment of triumph turn into complete disaster. Derek's knees buckled immediately, and he collapsed to the ground gasping like a fish out of water, his body unable to process the sudden trauma of being hit by someone who actually knew how to fight. His designer clothes offered no protection against Harold's decades of combat experience, and his gold chains jangled mockingly as he struggled to remember how breathing was supposed to work. The crowd erupted in shocked exclamations and nervous laughter, phones immediately turning to record Derek's humiliation from every possible angle. But Harold wasn't finished with his lesson in consequences. As Derek struggled to regain his composure on his hands and knees, Harold stepped closer and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the suddenly silent plaza. "The basics, son," Harold said calmly, his breathing barely affected by the physical exertion, "are simple. You treat people with respect, especially those who've earned it. You honor service and sacrifice. And, when you forget those lessons, someone reminds you. Today, that someone is me." Derek tried to speak but could only produce a strangled wheeze as his body fought to restart his breathing. His face had turned an alarming shade of red, and tears streamed down his cheeks from the physiological response to having his breath knocked out so completely. For the first time in his privileged life, Derek Williams was experiencing what it felt like to be truly helpless, and the sensation terrified him more than any lecture ever could. Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small American flag pin, the same one he wore to every veterans event and memorial service he attended. With deliberate ceremony, he dropped it onto the ground next to Derek's gasping form, where it landed on the expensive fabric of his designer shirt. "That flag represents everyone who ever fought for your right to act like a fool," Harold continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had earned his right to speak about sacrifice. "The difference is, they fought honorable enemies who could fight back. You pick on people who can't defend themselves because of duty and protocol. That makes you worse than a coward.